I remember the moment when it all fell apart. Standing there in the bathroom, staring at the piece of foil from a pill strip that had no business being in my house. It was the backing from a birth control pill, something my wife Sarah shouldn't need. I had gotten a vasectomy 2 years ago, right after our second child was born. So why would she be on the pill? My first thought was that she was sick, that maybe she hadn't told me something. But then the truth hit me, cold and unforgiving. The only reason she'd need birth control was if she was sleeping with someone else. I sat on the edge of the tub, my heart racing. The idea that Sarah, the woman I had loved for over a decade, could be betraying me like this was too much. I felt like I was suffocating. I needed answers, but I knew I couldn't just confront her, not yet. If she was cheating, I needed proof. That night, I ordered a DNA test kit online. I needed to know if our kids, my kids, were really mine. I hated myself for even considering it. But I couldn't shake the doubt that gnawed at me. Sarah had always been secretive about her phone lately, spending more time texting and guarding it like it held national secrets. I'd been blind, too trusting, but now I couldn't ignore the sign. When the DNA kits arrived, I felt like a man possessed. While Sarah was out, I took swabs from our kids, careful not to let them see the turmoil churning inside me. My son, James, looked so much like me, but my daughter? I couldn't help but wonder. I mailed the tests and tried to act normal, but inside I was unraveling. The nights were the worst. Sarah would lie beside me, her breathing soft and steady, while my mind raced with images of her with someone else. Had it been going on for years? Was it someone I knew? The questions tormented me, but I forced myself to wait. A week later, the results came in. I held the envelope in my shaking hands, knowing that whatever was inside would change my life forever. I opened it slowly, scanning the page until the words hit me like a freight train. Not a match. My daughter wasn't mine. My hands trembled as I read it again, hoping it was a mistake, but it wasn't. Everything I had built, the family I had cherished, was a lie. Rage bubbled up inside me, but I knew I had to stay calm. I needed to know the whole story before I did anything rash. That's when I decided to go nuclear. I started with her phone. I cloned it using software I'd researched for weeks. It wasn't easy, but eventually I had access to everything: her texts, emails, social media, and there it was, laid out in sickening detail. She'd been having an affair with him for over a year. The man she'd been sneaking off to see wasn't a stranger. It was Mark, her old friend from college. He'd even been at our wedding. It was right there in the messages, texts from the night of our wedding even. My mind couldn't process it. Sarah had slept with Mark on our wedding night. Our wedding night. The betrayal was beyond anything I had imagined. I read through the texts, my vision blurring with rage. She talked about how thrilling it had been, how she'd never felt so alive. It was like I didn't exist in her world, like our vows were just words. I knew what I had to do next. I called a lawyer and set the wheels in motion. But before that, I needed to confront her in a way she'd never forget. I booked a romantic weekend getaway, the same place we'd gone for our honeymoon. I played the loving husband, pretending I didn't know. She bought it completely. On the second night after dinner, I gave her a small gift. It was a box with the DNA results inside. She opened it, confused at first, until she saw the papers. Her face went pale, and I watched the realization hit her. "What is this?" she stammered, trying to laugh it off. "It's the truth," I said, my voice calm, too calm. "I know everything, Sarah, about Mark, about our daughter, about our wedding night." She started to cry, but I felt nothing. "Please, let me explain," she begged. But I was already done. I told her the divorce papers were on the way, and that I wanted nothing to do with her anymore. I watched as she broke down, but there was no going back. By the time we left that hotel, Sarah's life was in shambles. I exposed everything to her family, our friends. Even Mark's wife knew the truth by the end of the week. I wasn't going to let them get away with what they'd done, and I didn't care who got hurt in the process. Nuclear revenge. The only way to make sure she never forgets what she destroyed. After I served her the divorce papers, Sarah moved out of the house. We were living like strangers under the same roof anyway, so it wasn't much of a change. The kids stayed with me for now, though that would have to be sorted in court. I hadn't told them the full truth yet. How could I explain to them that their mother wasn't who we thought she was? But part of me wasn't ready to let it all go. It wasn't enough that I'd thrown her out of our lives. Sarah and Mark were going to face real consequences. And that's when an idea struck me. A way to drag this betrayal out into the open in a way that would hurt them as much as they had hurt me. I needed help. That's when I reached out to my old buddy, Mike, a private investigator I'd known since high school. Mike wasn't just any PI. He was thorough, ruthless, and a master at uncovering secrets that people thought they had buried. He owed me a favor from years ago, and it was time to cash in. When I met Mike at a local bar, I told him everything. He listened, swirling his drink as I explained the affair, the DNA results, and how I wanted to ruin them. Mike was a few years older than me, built like a linebacker who'd gone a bit soft with age, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "Damn, man," he said after I finished. "That's brutal. I don't blame you for wanting to torch the whole thing." "I want dirt on both of them," I said, leaning forward. "I want them to feel the pain they've caused me." Mike nodded. "I'll see what I can do, but be ready. You might find out more than you want to know." It didn't take long for Mike to start feeding me information. Within a week, he had tapped into Mark's life. Turns out Mark wasn't just cheating with Sarah. He was a serial cheater. He'd been juggling affairs with at least 2 other women, one of them being his own boss's wife. I couldn't believe it. The guy had no boundaries. And I was about to make sure his life imploded. Mike had also dug into Sarah's finances. She wasn't just moving in with Mark. She was siphoning money from our joint account to support his failing business. Apparently, Mark's so-called consulting firm was just a front. He was nearly bankrupt, using women like Sarah to keep his lifestyle afloat. Now I had the ammo. It was time to pull the trigger. I planned it carefully. First, I set up an anonymous tip to Mark's boss, who was not only his employer but also a close family friend. It didn't take much convincing to get him to believe Mark was fooling around with his wife. Mike had sent me photos, grainy but incriminating, that showed Mark leaving her house late at night. The fallout was immediate. Mark was fired, his reputation in tatters. Next came Sarah. I couldn't let her just fade out of my life quietly. She needed to feel the full weight of her choices. I gathered all the evidence I had, including financial statements, texts, and pictures Mike had dug up. Then, I sent it all to her parents. Her mother, who had always treated me like I wasn't good enough for their perfect daughter, went ballistic. I heard through the grapevine that she had confronted Sarah, calling her every name under the sun. And her father? He cut her off financially, refusing to support her while she played house with Mark. But there was more. Mark had a fiancée, a woman named Emily who had been blissfully unaware of everything. She was living in a different state, planning their future together while he was ruining mine. Mike and I tracked her down and I called her, feeling a strange mix of guilt and anger. "Emily, I don't know how to say this," I began, "but Mark isn't who you think he is. He's been sleeping with my wife for over a year, and others." The silence on the other end of the phone was heavy, and then a quiet sob. "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you for telling me." She hung up, but not before I sent her everything: photos, texts, proof of his lies. I wasn't sure what she'd do with it, but I knew Mark's life was about to get a lot more complicated. As for Sarah, the final blow came when I exposed the financial side of her betrayal. I filed a lawsuit against her for the money she had funneled to Mark. She wasn't expecting that. It blindsided her, and I could tell from her frantic texts and calls that she was panicking. The court had frozen her accounts pending investigation, leaving her with nothing but the mess she'd created with Mark. But then, something unexpected happened. A knock came at my door one evening. When I opened it, a woman stood there, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, with tired eyes and a quiet intensity. It was Emily, Mark's fiancée. "I'm not here to talk about Mark," she said, stepping into the hallway. "I'm here to talk about Sarah." Her words caught me off guard. "What about her?" Emily looked down, then met my eyes. "She's been using you and me. This thing with Mark isn't just about an affair. There's something else going on, something bigger." It felt like the ground shifted beneath me. What are you talking about? Emily sighed. Sarah and Mark have been working together. He's been conning women, and Sarah's part of it. They're not just sleeping together, they're running a scam. As Emily explained the full story, my world darkened even further. It wasn't just infidelity. Sarah had been helping Mark defraud women, funneling money through fake investments, and keeping me in the dark. I thought I'd already hit rock bottom, but now it seemed there was no end to the betrayal. And the revenge I'd planned wasn't enough. After Emily dropped that bombshell, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. Sarah wasn't just cheating, she was part of a full-blown scam, helping Mark fleece women out of their money. It was a whole new level of betrayal, something darker than I could have ever imagined. Emily and I sat in my living room, the tension between us thick as we sifted through the mess of lies. She had brought a folder of documents, proof that Mark and Sarah were running a shady investment scheme. It wasn't just money from our accounts. They'd been pulling this on several women, promising high returns on fake ventures. I thought he loved me, Emily said quietly, her voice trembling, but I guess I was just another Mark to him. I watched her as she sat across from me, her face a mixture of hurt and anger. I knew that look. I'd seen it in the mirror every morning since the DNA results came back. We were two people shattered by the same betrayal, trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces. You didn't deserve this, I said, my voice softer than I expected. Neither did you, she replied, meeting my eyes. For a moment, the weight of everything faded, and there was just the two of us. Two people who had been screwed over in the worst possible way. It's crazy, isn't it? How someone you trust can rip your whole world apart. Yeah, I muttered, my hands tightening around the edge of the coffee table. I thought I had a good life, a family. Turns out it was all a lie. Emily nodded, and for a second we sat in silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet you share with someone who gets it, someone who's been through the same hell you're going through. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. I'm going to nail him for this, she said, her voice firmer now. Mark thinks he can just waltz off into the sunset with Sarah, but he's not going to get away with it, and neither is she. I leaned back, watching her. There was something fierce about Emily. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't alone anymore. We were in this together now. Let's do it, I said, standing up. Let's take them both down. She turned to look at me, her eyes softening for the first time. You're serious? Dead serious, I replied, my heart pounding. They wrecked both of our lives. It's time we take control back. Emily smiled, a small, sad smile, but it was something. I hadn't seen anyone smile like that in a long time. Not since Sarah started lying. The weight of it all felt lighter, if only for a moment. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I became a team. She was relentless, helping me gather every piece of evidence we needed to build our case. Mike kept digging, and the deeper we went, the more twisted the whole thing became. Sarah and Mark had left a trail of ruined lives behind them. People whose money they had taken, whose trust they had broken. But in the middle of all that darkness, something unexpected started happening. Emily and I started spending more time together, not just going over documents and making plans. We'd grab coffee after meetings or sit in the park while we talked about everything but the chaos around us. She'd tell me about her life before Mark, and I'd open up about my kids, about how I was struggling to figure out how to tell them the truth about their mother. One evening, after a particularly long day of going over bank records, we found ourselves sitting in my backyard. The air was cool, and the sky was filled with stars, a rare sight in the city. Emily had her legs curled up on the chair next to me, sipping from a glass of wine. She looked different tonight, more relaxed, less guarded. I don't know how I'm going to move on after this, she said quietly. I gave him everything, and now I don't even know who I am anymore. I looked at her, feeling a strange pull in my chest. You're stronger than you think, Emily. Look at everything you've done these last few weeks. You didn't just sit there and let this happen. You fought back. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. And what about you? How are you holding up? I sighed, leaning back. Honestly, I don't know. Some days I feel like I'm going through the motions. Other days, I just want it all to end. Emily shifted in her seat, her gaze softening. "You're a good man, Luke. Don't let this mess destroy who you are." Her words hit me harder than I expected. No one had told me that in a long time. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt something other than anger or pain. I reached over and gently took her hand, surprised by how natural it felt. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked down at our hands, then up at me, her eyes searching mine. "Maybe we don't have to go through this alone," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Emily blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Maybe not." We sat like that for what felt like hours, the silence between us filled with more understanding than any words could offer. And then, without thinking, I leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was soft, a kiss that felt like the start of something new, something real. Emily kissed me back, her hand resting on my cheek, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel broken. I felt hope. When we finally pulled away, she smiled, a real smile this time. "We've still got a lot of work to do." "Yeah," I agreed, my heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "But we'll do it together." Emily squeezed my hand, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what came next, no matter how messy or painful, it was going to be okay. Because I wasn't just getting revenge anymore. I was starting over. And maybe, just maybe, I had found someone to start over with. The days following that kiss were a blur. Emily and I had crossed a line, but it didn't feel wrong. In fact, it felt like the first right thing to happen since everything had come crashing down. She became my rock, and in turn, I became hers. But amid this new connection, there was still unfinished business: Sarah and Mark. We had to finalize our plan. The lawsuit was already in motion, but now it was time to turn up the heat. Emily and I, along with Mike, had built a solid case: the stolen money, the fraudulent investments, and all the evidence of their affair. The courts would take care of the legal side, but I wanted to make sure their lives were upended in every possible way. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about taking back control of what they'd stolen from us. Emily was determined, too. Mark had broken her, but now she was standing tall, ready to fight back. Together, we were unstoppable. One morning, as we sat in my kitchen over coffee, Emily looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about something." I glanced up, intrigued. "What's that?" She took a sip of her coffee, then set the cup down. "What if we didn't just take them to court? What if we exposed them publicly?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean go public with all of it? Like social media, the whole 9 yards?" Emily nodded, her eyes sharp. "Exactly. Sarah and Mark have been hiding behind their lies for too long. I want everyone to know what they did. Their friends, their families, their colleagues. They don't get to slink away quietly and start over, like nothing happened." I thought about it for a moment. Part of me had wanted to keep this mess as private as possible, at least for the kids' sake. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. They hadn't just betrayed us. They'd betrayed everyone in their lives, and they deserved to be exposed. "All right," I said, nodding slowly. "Let's do it." That afternoon, Emily and I got to work. We drafted posts, carefully laying out the facts. Nothing overly emotional, just cold, hard truth. We included pictures of the bank transfers, messages between Sarah and Mark, and a timeline of their scam. By the time we were done, we had a damning narrative that no one could ignore. The night we were set to post, there was a nervous energy in the air. Emily sat beside me on the couch, her phone in hand, while I stared at the screen of my laptop. We were about to light the match that would burn down everything Sarah and Mark had built. "You ready?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. I nodded. "Yeah, let's do this." And with that, we hit post. Within minutes, the ripple effect started. Notifications pinged on our phones as people began to comment and share the posts. Messages flooded in, ranging from shock to support. Mark's business associates reached out in disbelief, while Sarah's friends, the ones who had always treated me like I was less than, now saw her for what she truly was. I hung up, the weight of everything settling heavily on my shoulders. For a moment, The room felt unbearably small, like the walls were closing in. Emily reached for my hand, her touch grounding me. "Luke," she said softly, "we have to do this." "It's the right thing," I nodded, though part of me wanted to protect my kids from the fallout. But I knew she was right. If we let this go, Mark would just move on to his next victim, his next scam. And Sarah, well, she'd made her choices. The next morning, I met with Mike in person. He laid out all the evidence, from the offshore accounts to the fraudulent charity records. It was airtight. When we finished, I made the call to the FBI. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but this was my life now. Emily stayed with me through it all. In the days leading up to the investigation, we tried to keep things as normal as possible. We still went for walks in the park, still found moments of quiet together, but there was an edge to everything now. A looming sense that the storm was about to hit, and when it hit hard. The FBI didn't waste time. Within days, they raided Mark's office and seized all his assets. It was all over the news. Mark was arrested on charges of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The media latched onto the story, digging into his past, exposing every dirty secret. And Sarah, she didn't escape the fallout. I watched the news in silence as they led Mark out of his house in handcuffs. Beside him, Sarah was pale, her face blank with shock, as they took her in for questioning. My heart twisted, not out of love or sympathy for her, but because of what this would do to our kids. They would have to see their mother dragged through the mud, her role in the whole mess exposed for the world to see. Later that evening, Emily and I sat together in the quiet of my living room. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me. The revenge had been served, but there was no joy in it. No sense of victory. Just a hollow emptiness where my family had once been. Emily rested her head on my shoulder, her presence the only comfort I had in the midst of the chaos. "You did the right thing," she whispered. "Then why doesn't it feel like it?" I asked, my voice low, filled with exhaustion. "Because it's not about winning," she said softly. "It's about doing what's right. And now, you can finally move on." I knew she was right. The weight of it all, the betrayal, the lies, the anger, was starting to lift. But in its place was something else. A sense of closure. Sarah and Mark would face the consequences of their actions, and I could finally step out from the wreckage of my old life. A few days later, I received a call from Sarah's lawyer. They wanted to settle the divorce quickly, with her pleading for leniency in the financial agreement. She had lost everything, her job, her reputation, and whatever future she thought she had with Mark. I agreed to the terms, not out of pity, but because I wanted it over. I didn't need more revenge. I had what I needed, my freedom. The final step was telling the kids. I sat them down, trying to explain as gently as I could what had happened with their mother. It wasn't easy, but I didn't sugarcoat it. They deserved the truth, as painful as it was. They cried, and I held them, promising them that no matter what, I would always be there for them. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to something resembling normal. Emily and I grew closer, our connection deepening beyond the shared pain of betrayal. We didn't rush into anything, but it was clear that what we had was real. One evening, after a quiet dinner at her place, Emily turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you think we can move on from all of this?" I took her hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers against mine. "I think we already are." As we stood there, the weight of the past finally began to fade, leaving only the promise of something new, something worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The months that followed were the calm after the storm. Life, for the first time in what felt like forever, began to settle into a routine. Emily and I were moving forward, but cautiously. The chaos of the past still lingered in our minds, but we were both determined to leave it behind. She had moved into her own place just a few blocks away, and though we spent a lot of time together, we hadn't officially defined what we were. That was fine with me. For the first time, I wasn't in a rush to figure everything out. The kids were adjusting too. They had struggled in the beginning, confused, hurt, and angry about what had happened with their mother. But with time, they seemed to find their footing. We had some tough conversations, especially with my son James, who was old enough to understand the gravity of everything. He asked questions I didn't always have answers for, but I did my best to be honest, without dragging him deeper into the ugliness. Then there was Emily. We leaned on each other a lot during that time, but it wasn't just the shared pain anymore. We were building something that felt real and steady. After everything we'd been through, it was hard to believe that there could still be hope, but she was my reminder that life could go on. There were nights when we'd stay up late, talking about the future, wondering what it would look like for both of us after everything we had lost. We didn't have all the answers, but that was okay. But just as things were beginning to feel normal again, life threw another curveball. One Friday evening, I was at home with the kids, getting ready for movie night. I'd ordered pizza, and they were excited to finally watch the new animated movie they'd been begging me to rent. It had become our weekly tradition since Sarah had left, something to bring us all together. Just as I was setting the popcorn down on the table, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something made me pick up. "Hello," I answered. There was a pause on the other end, then a voice I hadn't heard in months. "Luke, it's Sarah." Her voice sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't spoken to her since we finalized the divorce. Everything had been handled through lawyers, and I had made it clear I didn't want any personal contact unless it was about the kids. "What do you want, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my voice even, though my heart was already pounding. I need to talk to you. It's important." I stepped out of the living room, closing the door behind me so the kids couldn't hear. "You've got 5 minutes." Sarah's voice wavered on the other end, like she was struggling to keep it together. "I know I don't deserve your time, and I know I've hurt you more than anyone should ever be hurt. But I'm in trouble, Luke. Big trouble." I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. "You're already in trouble, Sarah. You and Mark are facing jail time. What more could there be?" There was a pause, and then she whispered, "It's Mark. He's dangerous." I didn't realize how bad it was until now. I was just caught up in it, but now he's threatening me. He says if I talk, he'll make sure I never see the kids again. I leaned against the wall, trying to process what she was saying. Part of me wanted to hang up and let her deal with the consequences of her own choices. But another part of me, a part I hated, felt the familiar pang of concern. This was the woman I'd built a life with, the mother of my children. I couldn't just ignore that, no matter how much damage she'd done. "Why should I believe you?" I asked, my voice hard. "You've lied to me about everything." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve your help. But I'm scared, Luke. Mark, he's not who I thought he was. He's worse than any of us knew." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I didn't want to get pulled back into her mess. Not now. Not when I was finally moving on. But something in her voice, the fear, the desperation, told me she wasn't faking this. "What do you want me to do?" I finally asked, my stomach twisting. "Just meet with me," she pleaded. "Please, just let me explain everything." I wouldn't ask if I wasn't terrified. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to say no. But if there was even a chance that Mark was a threat to my kids, I needed to know. "Fine," I said, my voice flat. "Tomorrow, noon, at the coffee shop near the park. But after this, we're done, Sarah." "Thank you," she whispered. And before I could respond, she hung up. I stood there for a long time, staring at my phone, the weight of the past, threatening to pull me back under. I didn't want to be part of her life anymore. I had moved on, built something with Emily, and started to heal. But now, Sarah's mess was seeping back into my world, and I knew this was going to complicate everything. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, I called Emily. I told her what had happened, and to my surprise, she didn't seem angry. She was calm, supportive, everything Sarah had never been. "You have to meet with her," Emily said. "If Mark is a threat, you need to know. For the kids' sake." "I know," I sighed, "but I hate that she's pulling me back into this." "She's not pulling you back," Emily said gently. "You're doing what you need to do, and after this, you'll have closure. You'll know you did everything you could to protect your kids." I felt a surge of gratitude for Emily. She didn't have to understand, but she did. She saw the bigger picture. and she didn't make me feel guilty for it. I realized then how lucky I was to have her in my life. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," she said with a soft laugh. "Just be careful, Luke." The next day, I met Sarah at the coffee shop, and as soon as I saw her, I could tell something was different. She looked thinner, more frail, and her eyes darted around like she was constantly expecting someone to jump out at her. "Luke," she said, sitting down across from me. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." "I'm not here for apologies, Sarah," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I'm here to find out what's going on with Mark. So start talking." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. "Mark, he's dangerous. More dangerous than any of us knew. The offshore accounts, the fraud. It's deeper than that. He's been laundering money for some really bad people, Luke, and now that the FBI is involved, he's panicking. He's threatening anyone who could bring him down." "And you're one of those people," I said, my voice cold. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't know, Luke. I swear I didn't know how deep it went. But now he's threatening me. He says he'll take the kids, that he'll destroy me if I talk." I stared at her, trying to gauge if she was telling the truth. It was hard to trust anything she said after all the lies. But the fear in her eyes looked real. And if Mark was willing to go that far, then my kids could be in danger too. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice low. Sarah leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Help me, Luke, please. I'll testify against him, but I need protection. I need someone who can keep him away from me, and the kids." I sat there, torn between the life I had built with Emily and the mess Sarah was dragging me back into. But one thing was clear. I had to protect my children, no matter what. "I'll help you," I said, my jaw clenched. "But after this, we're done. I'll make sure Mark can't hurt you or our kids, but you're on your own after that." Sarah nodded, her relief palpable. "Thank you, Luke. I don't deserve your help, but thank you." As I left the coffee shop, I felt the weight of the world pressing down on me again. This wasn't over. Mark wasn't done, and neither was I. The final chapter was still waiting to be written. The weeks that followed were tense, like a calm before the storm. Sarah's warning about Mark rattled me in ways I hadn't expected. I didn't trust her, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that Mark might be more dangerous than we realized. The FBI was involved now, and with Sarah willing to testify, everything was on the line. I kept my distance from Sarah as much as possible, but we had to work together on this, at least until the dust settled. Mike, my investigator friend, had stepped up his involvement, coordinating with the authorities to ensure Sarah and the kids were safe. I made sure to keep Emily in the loop, even though I could tell the situation weighed on her. She was supportive, understanding, but I knew this wasn't easy for her either. Every time I saw her, I felt a surge of gratitude. We'd both been through so much, and here she was, standing by my side through it all. Mark was getting desperate. Mike fed me updates from the FBI investigation. Mark had gone into hiding, pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to cut deals. But nothing was working. He knew the walls were closing in. It all came to a head one Friday night. Emily and I were at my house, the kids spending the weekend at my parents'. We were in the kitchen talking about plans for the weekend when my phone buzzed. It was Mike. "He's coming for her, Luke," Mike said, his voice urgent. "Mark's finally snapped. I got word he's heading to Sarah's place tonight." Panic flooded my system. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading. "Are the police on their way?" "They've been alerted, but I don't know if they'll get there in time." "You need to get over there. Now!" I hung up, grabbing my keys off the counter. Emily's eyes widened with concern. "What is it?" "It's Mark," I said, my voice tight. "He's going after Sarah." Emily's face paled. "Luke, you can't go alone. It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," I said, my heart racing. "I have to make sure she's okay. The kids, everything. I'll be fine. Just stay here, okay?" "No way," she said firmly, grabbing her jacket. "I'm coming with you. I'm not letting you face this alone." I knew there was no arguing with her. We jumped into my truck, the adrenaline pumping through my veins as I sped towards Sarah's house. My mind was racing. What if Mark got there first? What if he hurt her? As much as I wanted to keep Sarah out of my life, I couldn't let anything happen to her, not like this. When we pulled up to Sarah's place, the street was dark and eerily quiet. I parked a block away, not wanting to give ourselves away. Emily stayed close as we made our way up to the front door. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the doorknob, praying it was unlocked. It was. We stepped inside, and the house was dark, save for a faint light coming from the back room. My pulse quickened. I motioned for Emily to stay behind as I crept forward, the sound of my own breathing filling my ears. And then I heard it. Voices. Low, tense. Sarah and Mark. I moved closer, inching down the hallway, careful not to make a sound. Emily was right behind me, her breath shallow. As we approached the back room, the voices grew clearer. I told you, it's over. Sarah's voice trembling with fear. You're going to prison, Mark. There's nothing left for you to do. You think you can ruin me and just walk away? Mark's voice was menacing, filled with anger. You're just as guilty as I am. You think they'll protect you. You're going down with me, Sarah. I turned the corner, and there they were. Mark stood inches from Sarah, his face twisted with rage. He didn't see me at first. He was too focused on her, too consumed by his own fury. But Sarah spotted me, her eyes widening in shock. Mark spun around just as I stepped into the room. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment everything froze. He didn't say a word, but I could see the madness in his eyes. This wasn't just about escaping the law. He was dangerous, unhinged. Mark, I said, keeping my voice steady. It's over. The police are on their way. You need to leave before this gets worse. He laughed, an ugly, twisted sound. Worse? You think this is bad? You have no idea what I'm capable of. For a split second, I thought he might lunge at me, but then Emily stepped into the room, her presence breaking the tension. Mark's eyes flickered between us, realizing he was outnumbered, cornered. You don't want to do this, Emily said, her voice calm but firm. It's over, Mark. There's no way out. For a long moment, Mark just stood there, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, slowly, the fight seemed to drain out of him. His shoulders slumped, and he backed away from Sarah. You're all going to regret this, he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. I promise you that. Before I could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as police cars screeched to a halt outside. Mark's face twisted in frustration, but he didn't move. He knew it was over. Within minutes, the cops were inside, handcuffing Mark and leading him out the door. Sarah stood frozen, her hands shaking, her face pale. I watched in silence as they hauled Mark away, his threats echoing in my mind, but it was over. Finally. As the police finished up, Sarah turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and shame. Thank you, Luke. I don't deserve it, but thank you. I nodded, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Take care of yourself, Sarah. Without another word, Emily and I left the house, stepping out into the cool night air. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my chest finally start to ease. You okay? Emily asked softly, slipping her hand into mine. Yeah, I said, exhaling slowly. I think I am. As we walked back to the truck, I glanced over at Emily. The woman who had stood by me through all of this, the chaos, the pain, the uncertainty, was still here. She hadn't wavered, hadn't given up on me, even when I'd been dragged into a mess that wasn't hers to bear. And in that moment, I knew. I knew that after everything, I was ready to move forward, ready to leave the past behind and start something new. Something real. Emily smiled up at me, her eyes full of warmth. So, what now? I squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of peace wash over me for the first time in months. Now, I said, pulling her closer, we live. We move on. Together. And as we drove away from the darkness of the past, the future finally felt bright.